I want to welcome everybody to the University of Wyoming and the Hilton Conference Center for our afternoon. I'm going to still call 5:30 the afternoon discussion focusing on Obama's foreign policy and the new foreign policy team that we have in Washington. We can actually say that now since we've had the confirmation hearings for the key players. We're very lucky to have a prominent insider with us from the Washington Post and various other backgrounds, David Ignatius, to share his thoughts. I mean, he's been working in these circles for 25 years, and so we're really pleased to have his thoughts on Washington foreign policy challenges and the current president. Before introductions, however, I'd like to take a moment to thank Global and Area Studies partners. Over time, Global and Area Studies has done a lot of events around the state of Wyoming, and we've been really lucky to have the support of groups such as the Office of Academic Affairs, College of Arts and Sciences, particularly Dean Oliver Walter and Associate Dean Audrey Shalinsky. Of course, I have to say that the global areas, students, staff, and faculty are key to the success of our programming, in particular Carlinda Acey and Manuela Hopper-McIntyre, but also for this event, Josh Taboka and Eric Abbey, and some other graduate students. They've been key for putting this event together. You might not know, but we're also doing a workshop on the sidelines of this public talk, where we're looking at key challenges in American foreign policy, and some of our students are actually going to be writing a conference report, and so we're taking the dialogue on foreign policy outside of Washington, D.C., and this public talk will focus on kind of do that as well. I also want to say that long-term partners for us in putting our events around the state have included the Wyoming Humanities Council, the Ruth L. Logan Foundation, the U.S. Department of Education grant that we had for 3 years, and also here on campus, in particular, the International Studies Student Club. So without this kind of working together, we wouldn't be able to bring these important dialogues to Laramie and really 12 other communities around Wyoming. This event tonight will include David Ignatius' public remarks. We will have a Q&A session to follow. I will say just a couple of logistical comments, and that is that immediately after this talk, we have to exit this room. There will be a reception out here in the entryway, but we have to set this up for a dinner that's following this event. So don't feel pushed, but you will be pushed. But the conversation can continue out there. Okay, so let me move on to introductions. Mr. David Ignatius is a renowned journalist, an analyst who appears regularly on political talk shows. Out here, I've seen him most regularly between 4 and 7 a.m. on Morning Joe, and that tells you something about my lifestyle. But you've kept me awake some mornings, David, and I want to thank you for that. Did you also know he's a best-selling author of 8 or 9 different books, one of which has been made into a feature film, Body of Lies. I say that because I think he's known in his writing to bring his experience from the intelligence community and the foreign policy community, and putting that into his fiction as well. And they're very readable, and I recommend them to you. His distinguished 25-year career includes reporting for the Washington Post, Washington Monthly, Wall Street Journal, and the International Herald Tribune, covering a range of assignments, including the Justice Department, the CIA, the Senate. He's also been a long-term correspondent with a lot of experience in the Middle East, and also an award-winning diplomatic correspondent. I'm going to skip ahead a little bit and say a couple of things. His column has won the 2000 Gerald Loeb Award for commentary. He's got a couple of Edward Weintal Prizes, and he also has award-winning coverage for, I believe it's the Iraq War. You've probably read his narrative in Atlantic Monthly, the New York Times Magazine, Foreign Affairs, the New Republic. He is a graduate of Harvard College and King's College, Cambridge University, where he received a diploma in economics. He's here tonight to share his thoughts about the challenges facing U.S. foreign policy, his take on Obama and the new foreign policy team, and it's very timely indeed, as I noted earlier. Please help me welcome David Ignatius.
Thank you very much to Jean Garrison. Jean, the first thing I want to say is you're getting up too early. Anybody who's up at 4 a.m. Seeing me on the television could, do well to take another couple hours in bed. That's a wonderful introduction. I have to say, in my household, I have 3 daughters. The only achievement that has any distinction at all is this movie, Body of Lies, starring Leonardo DiCaprio. And that made me a big man in the household, especially when I got my daughter's pictures taken with Leo, as we call him in our house. Leo's arm around the girls and the girls beaming, and you can imagine that is nowhere near their Facebook pages or anything. I do want to talk about serious foreign policy subjects with you, and about the Obama administration, where it's been and where it's going, and the new team it has in place. I want to just start by telling you about the last time that I was in Laramie, because I think it will surprise you, and it will also say a little bit about how I ended up becoming a journalist, or at least the sort of person who would become a journalist. It was 1971, and as we all remember, that was a very different time. I was hitchhiking across the country. I had gotten all the way from Boston to Denver, and then I'd come north on the interstate, and I then got to Laramie, and I was going to try to hitchhike along Interstate 80, just keep going to California, which was my destination. And a Wyoming State Highway Patrol officer stopped me as I was standing there on the interstate with my thumb out and said, "Son, there's no hitchhiking in Wyoming." And I said, "Well, officer, what am I going to do?" And he said, "Start walking." And he meant it. He wanted me out of Laramie, and so I started walking down Interstate 80, and I kind of had my thumb out, hoping somebody would see it, and I could deny it if the officer came back. Somebody in a pickup truck stopped, and so I rattled across Wyoming in the back of the pickup truck, just thanking the Lord that I had someplace, I wasn't walking anymore. I remember then going south to Utah and went to Salt Lake City, and I caught a freight train in Salt Lake City, the kind of thing that Woody Guthrie did, and that you kind of imagine happening. And in 1971, I actually did it. There were all these migrant laborers and hobos on the train, and we kind of rolled off. I'll never forget the sight of Great Salt Lake as the sun set through the doors of this boxcar. And we kept going, and it's not easy traveling on a freight train, especially because a lot of the hobos on the train got drunk, and one fell off, literally. That was not so great. But we got finally into California, high in the Sierras. It's just beautiful. Just imagine that landscape, and there's still snow on the upper peaks, and the train stops, as freight trains do, for long, unexplained times. It had been stopped for at least 15 minutes. Didn't seem like it was going anywhere. Just below us, just down the bank, was a beautiful little mountain lake. So I thought, man, I'm so dirty and sweaty, and gosh, this looks so great. And it's 1971, so I ran down the bank and stripped down on my underpants and jumped in the lake. And of course, I don't have to tell you, I'm in, and this train starts moving. And so we're running up the bank, and running by the tread. If you'd gotten stuck there overnight, that wouldn't have been so good. And some of these hobos are reaching out. Anyway, I got on the train, made it to California. That's not on the standard resume. If you said, what are the career requirements for being a foreign policy columnist? That wouldn't come up. But the truth is, things like that. I was talking with some students beforehand, and we were just talking about all the interesting, unusual things they're going to do, go to Peru or go to Alaska or do some unusual thing, undoubtedly over the protest of their parents. I don't want to tell you what my parents had to say about all these antics. But the right answer usually is to try things and experiment. And that's one reason it's nice for me to be on a college campus and talking to all of you. So let me turn, having explained the kind of weird ways that somebody starts in my business, to talk about why you've come here and why I have, which is the Obama administration's foreign policy as it starts a new term. And I want to go back to the beginning, back to 2009, because I think it's really important to understand how Obama started, what he thought he was doing, what he thought his strategy was, the ways in which he was confounded in that strategy over the last 4 years, and then what he's trying to do now. The first thing that you'd say about Obama in 2009 was that he knew he didn't have much experience. So he reached out for a national security team that was unusually weighted with experience. He asked Bob Gates, who served in the Bush administration, to stay on as Secretary of Defense. Gates, in my judgment, probably will go down as one of the best Secretaries of Defense in modern times, because he was a wily old bureaucrat. He'd run the CIA, he'd helped run the NSC, and he knew how to make that impossible building and all the different pieces of it work. I've always thought his great success was that people were scared of it, because he fired people. I don't know if you remember, but Gates fired 2 service secretaries. He fired a chief of staff in one of the services, and people were afraid that they'd be next. So he got Bob Gates. He got Hillary Clinton, the person he just had run against. At the time, I thought that was a terrible mistake, but I would say now, at the end of 4 years, she did a pretty good job as Secretary of State. She worked really hard. She traveled all over. You see it. You see that she really tired herself out, but she did a good job. He hired as his national security advisor a man that he had barely met. I mean, others may know, but I think he'd met Jim Jones, 4-star Marine Corps general, the top of everybody's list for every job you can imagine. But the President asked him to be national security advisor, which is a job that usually has an intimate relationship with the President, and this was a person he really didn't know at all. And it showed the first 2 years. Jones really was a kind of outsider to the Obama inner circle. Rahm Emanuel, who was then his chief of staff, was almost like a prime minister, I thought, and he had his own key aide, Tom Donilon, who's now the national security advisor. So it was a very awkward beginning. But what it told you was the president, for starters, wanted this heavyweight team. A team of rivals was the way it was described. Very strong cabinet secretaries running their agencies. The second thing that I think Obama felt most strongly about as he came in was that after the Bush years, America was just too unpopular in the world. And I'll tell you, as somebody who travels a lot, I felt that myself in my travels. I felt that in places that historically had been American allies, where we'd had a lot of goodwill built up, you encountered instead a lot of hostility, a sense that America decided to go its own way. America was ignoring the United Nations. America was going to do it on its own or with a coalition of the willing. That was the phrase, not with a UN mandate. And so I think that was really, if you'd said to Obama in 2009, what's your number one priority? I think he would have answered to reconnect the United States to its traditional network of allies, to make the country less unpopular, to kind of go back in a sense to what was a more traditional way of managing American foreign policy. You could tell how excited the world was by that, or at least the lead opinion makers in the world, because Obama had barely been in office when he got the Nobel Peace Prize. I mean, you still couldn't be sure just what they gave it to him for, except that the world was really happy that America had an African American, children of an African father as president, and the symbolic importance of that, and then all of the ways in which Obama talked about changing things. In those early months, I always remember his trip to Cairo and his Cairo speech as a moment in which he was promising big fundamental changes in American policy. He was talking about the unacceptable situation with the Palestinians and the Israelis, the need for peace agreement. It was a very forceful approach. He talked in those early months about initiating contact with Iran, sent 2 initially secret letters to the supreme leader in Iran, asking for some way to open relations. He had what was known as a Russia reset. Relations with Russia had begun to decline, and so he made a very deliberate effort to think about what the Russians really wanted. They were very upset about U.S. missile defense plans, and to adjust U.S. policy so as to say, it's really important to us to have you as an ally and a partner. What was driving him was that he knew that already you could see that his efforts to negotiate with Iran weren't going anywhere, so he wanted Russia as a partner in trying to get tougher UN sanctions against Iran and try to build a coalition. So he came in with all these ideas, and I would say 2 things happened to him in 2009. One was domestic, and that was health care, and this impossible fight he got into over health care, which I think was more and more debilitating for him. But in a foreign policy sense, what happened to him was Afghanistan. I remember having lunch with a couple of other journalists with President Obama on the day that he announced his decision to add 30,000 U.S. troops in Afghanistan. He gave a speech you may remember at West Point. He went up to West Point, but that day at lunch beforehand in the library of the White House, which is a beautiful room on the first floor, he had a group of us around the table. And what was striking was how detached he was, I thought, from the policy that he was embarking on. When he was pushed on some of the details, you had a sense of the president not fully comfortable or confident with the policy. And I think we now know that the president had felt through the fall, through the long process of decision on Afghanistan, that he was being pushed by the military, that the military was in a sense, publicly lobbying him to support their strategy to add troops, and Obama, in a sense, felt cornered. And I think that feeling of getting deeper into a war that he was not entirely comfortable with is really important in understanding where he is now. This strong feeling that we see in his second term, we're not going to do this again. And I think what he's saying in part is, I made a mistake. I watched this process in Afghanistan, as some others who were here for the conference did. And what I remember is the tremendous enthusiasm that the military, U.S. military, had built up after what it felt was success for a new kind of strategy in Iraq. Dave Kilcullen, who's here, helped develop that strategy of counterinsurgency. We couldn't say we won in Iraq, but we sure ended up with a better outcome than we thought. And it was a result, in part, of this new and innovative way of trying to reach out to the population. And so people were tremendously enthusiastic about making that work in Afghanistan. I thought Obama himself was always somewhat skeptical, but they went ahead with it. They embraced the idea and principle. And I can remember going to Afghanistan in late 2009 and then in 2010, when they really, the military just, you can't go to these places and be with the U.S. military and not come away thinking, wow, it's working. I just talked to Colonel so-and-so, and, he told me this, and they're meeting with that guy, and, it's just so impressive to be with them. And when you're inside that bubble, obviously, people who lead our military don't want to think about failing. They want to think about succeeding, and it's very tough as a journalist to take the measure of that. But I thought that by the middle of 2010, after the big ballyhoo, I don't know if anybody here remembers Marja, but Marja was a town in Helmand province that was going to be the measure of our success. And the Marines went in there, and they were going to clean it out, and then we were going to get good government in, and the Afghan people were going to run things. And by the middle of 2010, you could tell that had really been oversold, that it wasn't turning out the way that even the commanders had thought and hoped. That what was succeeding was the tougher side, the sharp end of the spear, the night raids that U.S. Special Forces were making that really did rock the Taliban, the drone attacks on their bases in the tribal areas. So the harder edge stuff, as the military says, the very kinetic side was working, but the softer counterinsurgency strategy, I think, the White House decided more and more wasn't working. So what we ended up with was something that's very much a part of Obama going forward, which is what I call the covert commander-in-chief. It's funny, but this president, who's not really all that comfortable with the traditional commander-in-chief role, you don't see him as often, certainly as you did President Bush with the military, is very comfortable, it turns out, in this role of commanding the CIA's covert action capabilities, which is drone attacks, which went up very sharply after Obama became president, and then most notably in the raid that killed Osama bin Laden in May 2011. I don't know, many of you have probably seen this movie, Zero Dark 30. This is a part of our history we're trying to understand. But, from what I know, I think you have to credit Obama with making a tough decision that wasn't an obvious decision, and deserving a lot of credit for what was a fundamental turn. This man who paradoxically feels more comfortable exercising power in secret than he does with conventional military force, I think, he's decided less boots on the ground, more other forms of U.S. power. A final couple of observations about how we got here. First, this president, without, I think, intending to, ended up having the worst relationship with Israel that I can remember, certainly of any administration that I've covered. Maybe the Eisenhower administration in the 50s had a worse relationship, but that would be the only point of comparison. And it began with this idea that we got to make a breakthrough on the Palestinian issue. I can remember the confidence, overconfidence, you'd have to say, of the White House in 2009. I remember the first time Netanyahu came to Washington, meeting with him in Blair House, and he was rocked, not just by Obama, but he went out to Capitol Hill to see congressmen he thought would be very supportive. And at that point, they were siding with the president. They were saying, no, you've got to stop the settlements. And what I saw for the rest, really, of the first term was month by month, Obama got weaker politically, and Netanyahu got stronger. And after a while, the idea of any forward movement on the peace process was impossible. I think one thing we're going to see in the second term, we're already seeing it, is what I call an Israel reset. An effort to go back and start over again in this relationship. The strongest signs the president himself is going to go to Israel. It's now this month, later in March, and I'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. Probably the most consequential decisions that the president made involved the Arab Spring. I watched that happen in real time at Tahrir Square, and I just want to describe for people in this audience who may not, maybe you saw it on your TV screens, but we're going to be living with this for the rest of our lifetimes. And I just want to tell you what being in the middle of a revolution looks like. If you can imagine a square, no place in Wyoming quite fits, but imagine a great big square with 1 million people in it. And imagine that those 1 million people, which would be, normal times, a very chaotic, disorganized situation, no police, nobody to keep order. There was a sort of self-ordering process going on in the days when the revolution in Egypt was succeeding. And I watched that, and I remember thinking, this is how revolutions begin. They begin always being very lovable. They begin without leaders. They begin with people spontaneously in the streets, chanting slogans about freedom and in this case, revolting against a secret police. Egypt under Mubarak had a lot of nice qualities, but it was basically run by its mukhabarat, by its security service, like most countries in the Arab world. And so people were standing up against that. And the decisive decision that Obama made, and it was based on, I think, his whole life experience, was on February 1, after Hosni Mubarak had said, I'll resign, or I won't run again, and my son won't run either, which is what we basically had asked him to say, Obama decided that's not enough. And I'm told that what he said to people in the White House was, I grew up in Indonesia under a regime like this. And that's true. The Suharto regime, which was governing Indonesia then, was the same kind of repressive, autocratic regime. I know what this is. I know that this is wrong. And I know, more to the point, that we can't stop it. And I think that was the key decision. And the next day, Obama called Mubarak and said, you have to leave now. Mubarak never talked to him again. He was forced out of power a couple weeks later. And then this revolution began to roll forward. And I think it's fair to say that the United States, President Obama, has made a huge bet on the idea that as democratic rulers of Egypt, the people who once were in prison, the Muslim Brotherhood members, will learn the discipline that democracy is all about, and will end up being acceptable modern leaders. So, to talk for a moment about the election, I wish that Obama as president could be as strategic as he was as a politician. Obama went into the election with the judgment of his advisors that this was not an election about 50 states. This was an election about 9 states. I don't know how many in the audience worked for either candidate in trying to get out the vote in Wyoming, but it's really amazing to look at this just as a technical piece of politics and the skill and success of the Obama operatives. I wish they governed as effectively as they ran for office. For me, the moment that I remember about this election campaign was after Hurricane Sandy hit, and when you saw Obama and the governor of New Jersey, Chris Christie, together, kind of tall, skinny president, this fat New Jersey governor, arm in arm, trying to solve the country's problems. And I felt that that resonated with a country that really is fed up with the dysfunction in Washington. And on one level, our election seemed to feed it, but I think people really are fed up with it. I'd love if we get to questions to hear your thoughts about what began today, this famous sequester, and whether you think it's serious or not. But I think that moment, that image, is what the public liked about Obama. So now the administration is in round 2. Obama has a new team, which is, as I wrote the other week, quite different. Where he had before people with strong personalities, often quite independent perspectives. Now he has a team that pretty much is all going in the same direction. John Kerry, his Secretary of State, I like to say, has the advantage of having failed in life. He knows the things that you know if you don't succeed. He ran for president in 2004, and he had a very tough defeat. And he came back from that. He's really wanted to be Secretary of State. He's off traveling now, trying to put together the elements of his Middle East policy. He just has gotten Chuck Hagel confirmed after a really bloody fight. A person who tells you really the essence of what this new team is about is the man he chose to head the CIA, John Brennan. Obama did something really quite interesting and risky for him, which is putting Dave Petraeus, a guy with a huge independent reputation, the most prominent general this country has produced, really, in modern times. It's easy to forget now after his fall in this sad story in the last few months. But he was on top of the world, and Obama reached out to him and said, I want you to take on really the most sensitive job, the most sensitive relationship that a president has. And it went pretty well. But next time around, Obama decided to pick the person who I'm told is really the one he's most relied on in the most difficult, dark decisions of his presidency, which is counterterrorism policy, the decision of who to target with drones, of who to go after, of what the rules will be. This is the stuff that, if your president, keeps you awake at night. This is not a president who thought he was getting elected to kill people, to go after our enemies with this weapon and take them out one by one. But that's what he's ended up doing, and the person he did it with is John Brennan. So it's telling that that's the one he wanted to come in at CIA, not someone else. So this new team, much closer to Obama, has got a series of problems coming at them, and I just want to quickly walk through them and then turn to your questions. And I want to start with Syria, which in a sense is the one that I feel I actually know something about, because in the fall, in October, I did a sort of crazy thing, a little bit like riding a freight train from Salt Lake City, which was to sneak into Syria with the help of the rebels in the Free Syrian Army, and to travel around with them for a couple of days in northern Syria. I went into Aleppo, which then as now was really the hottest battleground of this war. And I saw three basic things that I want to share with the audience. So then you don't have to smuggle into Syria, because I will have told you, and you now know them. The first thing that you know as you travel around hours in any direction is that even in October, this is 5 months ago, the rural north of the country, but I'd say the whole of the rural country, is gone. It will not be governed by Bashar al-Assad ever again. There's this idea that the Russians have, that some other people seem to have, that somehow the regime, Assad, or some version of the regime, no, it's not possible. And you just see that with your own eyes. In all this driving back and forth, I never once encountered a Syrian army or government, checkpoint, roadblock, any presence at all. That's amazing, and that was 5 months ago. Second thing that you see is that the opposition that the United States is now backing, as you've seen if you read the papers in the last week, we've decided to step up our assistance so that it's going to include not weapons, but just about everything else, all kinds of non-lethal equipment. This opposition has been really disorganized. I saw that traveling with the fighters. I mean, there's nothing like waking up in one of their command outposts and seeing guys with cigarettes dangling from their lips, loading their ammo clips, and it's just handing out wads of cash this thick to pay off their people. It was just like, it's a militia. It's not an army. And what it needs is the kind of discipline and command and control that working with the U.S. and other allied countries could provide. It needed that in October. I wish we'd been doing it then, and it needs it now. And I'm glad that we're finally getting into this business in earnest because of fact 3 that I found there. In the absence of a strong, well-organized opposition army, the extremists who are literally, specifically offshoots of al-Qaeda have gotten stronger and stronger. I saw some of their members when I was in Aleppo, the place where I was, which was the Free Syrian Army headquarters, I was told was literally next door to the command headquarters of this al-Nusra Front, which is part of al-Qaeda. So the only way the U.S. is going to have any hope of checking the growth, I mean, think about this. This is an al-Qaeda affiliate that is increasingly powerful in a country on the Mediterranean, really at the door of Europe, and I think that the U.S. did really very little about this. Obama stopped foreign policy effectively for the election in the summer, and they finally picked it up again. Kerry personally takes this very seriously, so I think we're on the way to a better policy. I talk one advantage or disadvantage of having done this crazy thing of sneaking into the country is that I talk to the Free Syrian Army intelligence people and commanders all the time, almost every day. and I talked last Friday to their new commander, who I'm happy to say said only sensible things about where this should go. I mean, starting with, he said, I'm ready to meet any time with Syrian army officers who did not order the killing of Syrian civilians, which is, that's saying, except for the inner circle around Assad, I'm willing to talk to people, specifically so as to maintain order in the country after Assad goes. I mean, that's the thing we all have to think about is, he's gone for the reason I said a little while ago. He's not going to govern again. Well, what's going to come after him? And how are we going to help shape an opposition that, as it becomes the new government, is going to have enough strength and good sense to be able to operate? And I do feel a little bit more confident about that. Second problem that's coming at him fast, and we may have just seen this last week a big change in this story, is Iran and the nuclear program in Iran and the president's commitment under duress from Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu, but his commitment publicly, repeatedly, that he will prevent he'll prevent Iran from obtaining a nuclear weapon. And I always say to people, if the president says that as specifically and repeatedly as he has, you have to take it seriously. So what that means is that even though this is an incredibly war-weary country, I mean, this is a country that the last thing we want is another war in the Middle East. People do need to understand that if you can't find some way to negotiate a settlement of this that stops Iran well short of having a nuclear weapon, we're on a collision course. I often like to quote the statement of my mentor at Harvard, Graham Allison, who says, the Iran nuclear confrontation is the Cuban Missile Crisis in slow motion. It's happened so slowly, over years, that you forget that unless something's done, unless something like what President Kennedy famously did in thinking of a diplomatic breakthrough with the Soviet Union, unless something like that is done with Iran, we're on a collision course. We're going to end up colliding. So the talks that were just held this last week in Kazakhstan, of all places, between U.S. negotiators and the Iranians, where expectations were super low, actually seem to have been more positive than any of these sessions to date. Or at least that's what the Iranians want to tell their public. And in a sense, that's even more important than the specifics of what were discussed. The Iranians clearly are preparing their public through their media by saying that the West has capitulated to their terms. They're preparing the public for a deal that will essentially cap their enrichment at about 5%, that will export almost all of their existing stockpile of 20% uranium, will work with the IAEA to do this and that. I could go through all the details, but I think the point to make is that under pressure, under the sanctions that Obama has put in place, the Iranians do seem to be turning a little bit. I want to talk about a final problem that I actually wrote my column about this weekend, so it's very much on my mind. But it runs through the issues that we're talking about at the conference that Gene has organized here, and I think it's in the category of things that the United States most needs to figure out to be effective in foreign policy in the world. It's obvious to all of us, as certainly a sort of basic premise of this administration in its second term, that we're not going to have more wars like Iraq and Afghanistan. And that's where the president is, that's where the country is. You could see in the debates between Obama and Romney. Romney started out with a very hawkish line on foreign policy. By the last debate, because of what he was picking up from his polls, his foreign policy positions were virtually identical to those of the president's, because he was reading the country. We're tired. We don't want to do this again. And so, we, at the same time that we don't want to get involved in all these difficult problems, we have a world in enormous turmoil. And as I travel around the Arab world, this is a revolution. And like every revolution, it could be positive, as ours was in America, or it could be really negative, as the Russian Revolution was, as the French Revolution, certainly for a long while was, as the Iranian Revolution was. So the idea that we should just watch this and sort of hope and pray, I don't think that's a good policy. But how can we influence it? And that's what I want to focus on. We don't yet have a way, as a country, for projecting power other than military force that works very well. If you travel to Washington and went to the conferences that I go to, you'd hear people talk just all the time about what we need is smart power. People stop saying soft power. That sounds too soft. We need smart power. We need to exercise power, not boots on the ground. We don't need no more drone attack. We need smart power. Well, that sounds terrific. How are we going to do that? At present, we have a whole series of agencies that you probably have never heard of because they're not the focus of anybody's attention, that are dealing with little pieces of this problem. We have the U.S. Agency for International Development that's supposed to hand out development assistance. It's been a really tough bureaucracy to manage for every administration. We have the U.S. Institute of Peace, which has the nicest headquarters in Washington. It's beautiful, right on the Potomac, gorgeous building. But, it sort of doesn't want to be U.S. government, doesn't want to cooperate with the State Department. We have the State Department Bureau of, I want to get this right, Conflict and Stabilization Operations, which, okay, let's let them do it. Well, it has 165 people. It's going down in size. It is so small that it can't even, tell other bureaus in the State Department what to do. So that's not the answer. We have the CIA, which has a mission of political covert action, which is all about shaping events in the world. But the CIA thinks it wants to get back to collecting intelligence, thank you very much, and stop doing so much covert action. So the biggest problem that we have, I think, in terms of projecting power, there are a lot of other problems that Gene's group has talked about and we'll talk about. But in this sense, the biggest problem we have is finding a way, non-military way, to help, assist, influence, shape a world that's in transformation. And somehow, the White House has got to figure out a way to either pull these existing bureaucracies together or create some overarching structure. So I want to, Gene, if this is a good time, turn to your questions. I'd be happy to talk about anything, but today is the day that the sequestration process began. I've been writing and thinking a lot about it, and I'd be especially happy to talk about that if people would like to.
Ted Holmes from Wyoming. Could you give your opinion on North Korea and Mr. Obama's second 4 years?
If you were going to list a problem where the U.S. has failed, not just in this administration, but in the previous several, it would be North Korea. We keep drawing lines, organizing multi-nation groups to try to deal with it, and none of it has worked. This latest North Korean nuclear test is said to have shocked China even more than the United States. And so it's obviously an example of an unsuccessful policy. U.S. officials have just been talking with the South Koreans, and they just have had a visit to Washington from the new seemingly tougher-minded Japanese prime minister. So, if nothing else, you could say that what North Korea is doing is getting other Asian neighbors more upset, more willing to work with the U.S., more willing to talk about ways of containing North Korea. What I know the White House says, but they just haven't done much with this, is that the key to this is China, and China has to realize if North Korea continues with its nuclear tests and its missile development, North Korea is going to threaten the United States, not just South Korea, not just Japan, but the United States. And the United States will have to respond appropriately, and that will mean changes that China in particular won't like. So I think you'd have to say the main thing about the policy is it's not working. There are a lot of things the U.S. can do defensively so that the North Korean threat, in truth, to the homeland is zero. But in terms of actually turning this around, I haven't yet heard a good analysis policy proposal. I think one problem with North Korea is it's so closed that the quality of our information about what goes on there is just terrible.
Hi, Kathleen Booth from here at UW. You talked briefly about the Israeli-Palestinian situation, but could you go into more depth about kind of what you see in the next 4 years coming from the Obama administration?
Well, the first thing I see coming is President Obama's trip there. And I described that earlier in my remarks as a reset of U.S.-Israel policy. And it's overdue. It's clear that the policy we had was the U.S. isn't much use to the Arab world as a peace broker if it has effectively no working relationship with the Israeli prime minister. I think that when Barack Obama goes to Israel and makes what I'm sure will be a good, powerful speech, that's going to have an effect on the Israeli public. I think, much as in the Cairo speech, is a way in which he will speak to kind of universal values that Israelis feel they want Israel to stand for. That having this African American president there in Israel, I'm sure he'll talk about the Holocaust. I'm sure he'll talk about what special meaning that has for him given his life history. I would be surprised if that didn't have some effect, at least short run, on Israeli public opinion. There are all these interesting signs that Israelis are not comfortable with where they are. They don't, like every player in this conflict, they don't know how to get out of where they are. But there's a new movie that was nominated for an Oscar, it didn't win, in the documentary category called The Gatekeepers, which is interviews with the last or 6 recent heads of the Israeli security service, Shin Bet, which is really scary. It keeps order and these guys who run this very tough-minded organization say in the documentary, looking back on their careers, that they feel as if all of the tough-minded policies they adopted weren't enough, and that somehow Israel has to find a way to make this Palestinian state happen for its own reasons, for its own security reasons. One of these guys says in the documentary, from the preview I saw, that there's something about leaving this job when you look back on your experiences that turns you into a liberal. And I thought that was fascinating. So, Netanyahu and Obama have, just a terrible relationship. They really don't like each other. But maybe with this visit will be the beginning of turning that around. It's a truism to say that you can't make peace unless the parties to the conflict want it and are ready for it. I think that misses a key fact, which is that the United States, as Israel's overwhelmingly powerful ally, is in a position to say this is the shape of the deal that will work. I mean, the funny thing about the Israeli-Palestinian problem is that anybody who looks at it could tell you what the elements of the final deal will be. They're well known. They were part of the Clinton parameters when President Clinton was president. Condoleezza Rice, working with Ehud Olmert, sponsored negotiations where they got so close. Olmert drew a map of what the Palestinian state would look like. He had a solution to the problem of Jerusalem, the insoluble problem of Jerusalem. He had a solution to the problem of refugees. I mean, that's how close they got. And the U.S. decided it couldn't or wouldn't weigh in, and so that one fell apart. But everybody knows what the basic shape of the deal is like, and I hope after this trip that the United States will be a little bit more explicit. Don't leave the parties to invent this from scratch, because they never will. So I'd love to see a more active role.
Chief during the trip to Syria, did you find any involvement or encouragement from Iran at all? If there was.
I didn't get near anywhere that any Iranian would be. Obviously, it's said by the rebel fighters that the Iranians are sending snipers into the front lines in Aleppo, and so in some of the places where I was quite close to, I may have been closer to Iranians than I realized, but not to my knowledge. One of the really interesting questions for me, and if we had Secretary of State Kerry here, this is one of the things I'd put to him. At some point, Iran is going to realize that Assad can't last. They're going to. The reality that I was describing to you surely must be increasingly obvious to them. So at some point, they're going to want to make a transition for their own self-interest to something else. And how are they going to do that? And more to the point, in some ways, how is Hezbollah going to do that? I meet often when I go to Beirut with Hezbollah officials. I'm a journalist. I can talk to whoever I want, and I do. And I'll tell you, they're nervous. They see that the status quo, which has been part of their lifeline, is changing. So, a very interesting question is whether Iran, for its own reasons, would want to turn, maybe in the context of a broader diplomatic engagement that involved a nuclear effort, and in effect support a change of regime from Assad to somebody else. And we'll just have to see. I happen to know that this questioner has the most wonderful history of having come to Wyoming via Nepal and Singapore. And when you told me your story, I thought, at first I admired you for doing this, but I thought, this is one of the really wonderful things about America. You got this terrific university here in Laramie, Wyoming, that you never heard of, and you weren't sure you wanted to go to, and you're sitting around joking with your friends from your class about goofing off out here on the plains. So I thought, well, at least we still got that going for us. So we've got universities that people want to come to.
And based on your comments about where you think the American public is going, getting tired of stuff and all that, what do you think the public's influence on the use of covert power could be?
It's a great question. The Brennan confirmation hearings that have just taken place and the discussion that they prompted of our use of drones was the first real, I think, open public debate about this. And it's crucial that the country have it. As I look at this from the perspective of a journalist, and I don't know what I don't know, but I worry that drones are such an easy way to project power without taking risks, without having your own boots on the ground, without putting your own military lives at risk, that drones can become addictive. I mentioned Dave Kilcullen, who's here as a speaker. He wrote in his book, The Accidental Guerrilla, that's the name of the book, yeah, that there's a way in which we end up creating enemies people who didn't intend to be our enemies, but got caught up in a drone attack or even just reading propaganda, because often the accounts of these attacks are propaganda, and ended up becoming enemies of the United States, hating American power by accident. They didn't intend it, and we certainly didn't intend it, but that's the way it ends up. So we're having a debate now about what the rules should be. And I'll tell you what my own hope is for this. I really like the idea of drones and the ability they offer to take people out, with incredible precision, using them in effect as deterrents, where we say to people, by making clear what our rules are in these hearings, and I hope some more formal process, we say to people, if you threaten the United States, if you target our homeland the way Al-Qaeda did on September 11th, if you target Americans abroad or our facilities, we're going to come after you, and we have the ability to do it. But if you don't do that, if you can try to overthrow the government of Somalia, or you can try to take power in Yemen, or but if you don't threaten us, we are not going to use this extraordinary power that we have. And the hope of that kind of deterrence idea would be that you draw a line, and that you give people a very powerful, self-interested reason to stay on one side of it. So I think that is the idea that John Brennan, the new CIA director, has. I think it's the idea that President Obama has, although it hasn't been stated quite the way that I did. But if we could get to that, I think that would make sense. There's no question that these weapons, in dealing with an adversary that wanted to kill, as many of us as it could, were really effective in the tribal areas. I mean, I visited South Waziristan on one of my crazy trips, and I saw one of these drones over South Waziristan as I was leaving in a little 2-engine Pakistani plane, and just trying to imagine what it's, that's power, and it had a great effect there, I think, in a good way, in just taking down the infrastructure of Al-Qaeda in the tribal areas.
Hi, Patrick Irish here from Laramie. By the way, in 1971 I was trying to get to Minnesota from Arizona, and Colorado was illegal to hitchhike through as well. I'd like you to address what seems to me the most confusing thing about most administrations, especially this one, is the balancing, an attempt to balance idealism versus pragmatism. I'll give you an example. I spent 3 years in Bahrain, and I was upset that the administration, because of the naval unit there, would not support the Shiites who were rioting against the Sunni, as well as there was complaint about the Green Revolution in Iran.
It's a terrific question. It's something I meant to mention, and I'm glad you give me a chance to do it. If you're talking about foreign policy and the basic framework for foreign policy, a part of that is thinking about how a president and his advisors should go about balancing our country's values, our belief in democracy, our belief that the majority in Bahrain, which is Shia, should have representation, should have power, versus our interests. And our interests in the Gulf traditionally have focused on Saudi oil, and in Bahrain focused on Bahrain as the headquarters for our Fifth Fleet, which you remember well. In the case of Bahrain, this administration tried, I think it's been in some ways the most painful example of trying to balance those two. And in the end, after pushing the Bahraini royal family, which is Sunni, which wants to hold on to power, pushing them to open up to the Shia majority, to have a process of negotiation, acceded to Saudi Arabia's decision that this was unacceptable. The Saudis sent troops across the causeway. The United States essentially did nothing. And So in this moment, we decided that our interests trumped our values. I just was in Saudi Arabia in January and was talking with Saudi princes, officials about this issue. And they kept talking about the terrible Iranian sponsorship of the Shia radicals was, and it's all a plot and this and that. And I finally said with one other person who was there, you don't understand the problem. It's one thing if your policy would work, if you could suppress the Shia majority indefinitely and get away with it. Well, you can make an argument for it, but that's not going to work. It's in the long run, as your question suggests, you can't keep the majority down there forever. So the hope is that again, there'll be some opening. The Iranians keep trying to suggest that Syria, Bahrain, these should be in the agenda of Iran's discussions with the United States when we ever get down to that. And I think that's an interesting question. I'm actually not as against that as some people. I think the idea of making Iran a more responsible partner in that part of the world is a good thing. It would be in our interest, not against our interest.
Originating from Eastern Seminary in University of Wyoming. I was interested about when you're talking about how America has no other way to project power than the military force. And you talk about a lot about the government offices like CIA and stuff. And what do you consider in how is multinational companies doing this? For instance, we're talking about like globalization in a lot of places, and we're talking about Walmart in a lot of places. For instance, in one city I stayed in China, after Walmart came in, all the rest of the supermarket bankrupted because there was no way to compete with Walmart. And I'm sure if Walmart can do something, say, in terms of influence a culture-wise, they can easily do it. And so I think that's one of the soft power, I guess, you're talking about.
That's a great comment. The fact of life around the world is the interconnectedness of the global economy and the way in which communications technology makes that immediate to everybody. I mean, everybody's looking at the same screen, in effect, and seeing the same products. And one of our speakers at this conference made a wonderful point about the incredible expansion of the global middle class that's going to take place over the next few decades. And one surprise to me is that even as globalization proves irresistible in economic terms, it has quite limited effect on political developments. I mean, you'd think that Walmart, with all its power, Walmart is the biggest foreign retailer in China. I just happened to have sat with the top executive of Walmart, who said that their influence is nil in India, which they think is a fabulous potential market for Walmart. The state regulation by each individual Indian state is so overwhelming. They just don't know how to deal with it. There was this huge. Walmart's revenues every year are $500 billion. It's an incredible number. And yet, in terms of influencing the politics of the places where it operates, I think it is in no way a dominant factor. We've seen in China that you can have a booming capitalist economy generating wealth in a way that I've never seen in my lifetime. And I still think that's one of the miraculous stories of the time in which I've been alive, is the way in which China's gone from incredible poverty to the beginnings of real wealth. And it's great. I mean, anybody who thinks it's a bad thing, I think, is nuts. But they've done that. They've become this capitalist engine without changing their one-party political system, and without having the kind of democratic rights and openness that we think is part of being a modern country. And the ability of all the companies that are operating there to change that seems very small. So, I know the world is sick of America pushing for our values, and I think a lot of Americans are sort of sick of us doing that. We've heard a little bit about that in our conference. But one thing I find when I travel is that young people in this connected world aren't that different from my 3 daughters. I mean, they want to be free. They want to be able to express their opinions. They want to be able to connect with the world in the way that technology now allows them to. So I think American policies that try to help people do that are a good thing, even if they come with risk.
Callie Berman from University of Wyoming. Latin America seems to largely be absent from our discourse on creating a new grand strategy and foreign policy in general. And granted, I think that many of our recent discussions have highlighted that the U.S. needs to emphasize many of the challenges that you've been describing. But what role do you see Latin America playing in terms of challenges and alliances in the next 10 years?
Let me take one more over
yes.
here. Okay, thanks.
Yes. Terrorism has been the hallmark of American foreign policy for the last 20, 30 years. Do you foresee a time at which the United States might abdicate this and think of something else?
How about yesterday? So the Latin America question, and is it all right if I embarrass you slightly by describing the conversation we had before this session? So I asked, the young lady who asked this question has a triple major, and it involves geology and environment, and so I said, the thing that anybody who doesn't really know anything would ask, like, okay, so what about fracking? Is fracking, is that a big threat? And the young lady, I just say this so that people will be proud of the University of Wyoming students, said, that depends on the nature of the formation. And I thought it was such a smart answer that I hope you don't mind my embarrassing you, but you obviously have had good teachers. I am so bad on the subject of Latin America because I don't travel there, so I just feel I'm repeating what I hear from other people. But let me hear something, say something that I just did hear from an administration official who helped shape policy. One thing that is not all that talked about that Obama is trying to do, which I think is really good, and that I wish had more popular support, is the idea of opening up trade and using trade as a way to stimulate our economy and economies overseas. I do think, as somebody who's an economist, that that's how it works. I mean, trade ends up making both sides better if it's properly administered. So we have this new so-called Trans-Pacific Partnership in Asia, and it's actually sort of taking off. I mean, it started really small with little countries, and all of a sudden Mexico has decided it wants to join, and Canada, and maybe Japan, and geez, it's really going to be a big deal. So then they just announced a new one for Europe, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, I think it's called. And that's a really good idea. I mean, Europe's really on its back. Europe needs markets to sell its products. A recovering Europe is a market for our products. Investment goes back and forth in ways that are mutually beneficial. So that's all a prelude to saying. I just heard officials say, given that we're really doing this now, and that we're seeing this as an important core element of U.S. strategy, let's do it in our own hemisphere. That trying to think about real trade and investment partnerships in Latin America is the next place that the U.S. ought to go during the time that Obama is president. So I would bet that will be coming up on the agenda. It's a really interesting idea. Now, again, I'm somebody who thinks free trade is a good thing. A lot of people who don't, but I do. And so the idea of incorporating our hemisphere into this great big idea, I'm all for. Terrorism. Are we ever going to get off the war on terrorism? I mean, it's a great question. I think one way to answer it is to quote Osama bin Laden, the late. I had a chance to look at some of the documents that were taken from his hideaway in Abbottabad and were declassified and were shown to me last spring. And what's fascinating is that in bin Laden's final months, he was, in his correspondence, dealing with what he and his top advisors felt was al-Qaeda's failure to get traction, in part because of Obama's success in moving away from the war on terrorism rhetoric that George Bush had used. And there's this one fascinating memo in which it's not clear exactly who wrote this, but it probably was Atiyah Abdul Rahman, who was the key advisor and kind of link man for bin Laden in his correspondence. And it's literally about rebranding. And they propose a series of 10 names other than Al Qaeda that you could use, and they're the most impossible. You think, geez, this wouldn't do very well in the advertising world. But what it said is that bin Laden himself had concluded that there had been a change in U.S. policy, that instead of a war on terrorism and the implication of war on Muslim terrorism, it was now a war on Al Qaeda, a specific organization and its leadership who had targeted the U.S. And I think, that's the best testimony I could think of from bin Laden himself, that change was a good one. And the more of that, the better. It's clear in our policy of basically trying to work with the Muslim Brotherhood government in Tunisia, in Egypt. I mean, if you travel around Egypt and talk to secular activists, internet activists, they'd say, why is the U.S. so supportive of these Muslim groups? Not why is the U.S. so antagonistic. So I think the Obama administration has made a change. I think there have been a lot of benefits to it. I think the thing you'd like to see happen, in part, already has happened. So thank you very much.